the orphan girl, fed a wounded Apache. His tribe returned with gifts at dawn. The wind pushed softly across the wheat stubble as evening settled over the settlement's edge, and 12-year-old Eliza Turner hurried along the fence line with the half-empty tin bowl she'd saved from supper, clutching it close so none of the boys from the bunkhouse would see. She didn't like wasting food, but tonight something inside her whispered that the scraps weren't meant for her. And when she reached the old, collapsed barn, the one nobody used since the storms broke its roof, she slipped through the leaning doorway, her breath catching when she saw the same sight that had made her freeze the night before. The wounded Apache warrior lying in the hay, blood dried along his ribs, his breathing shallow but steady. His dark eyes lifting the moment she entered, as if he had been listening for her. She should have run the first time, should have screamed for the sheriff or fetched the men, because everyone in town said Apaches were dangerous. But yesterday, when she'd found him half-conscious and burning with fever, something in his face, something tired and strangely gentle, had held her in place. And now she stepped forward again, her heart thudding in her chest. "I brought you food," she whispered, though her voice trembled as she held out the bowl. And he watched her not like a trapped animal, but like a man who didn't understand why a child from a white settlement would return to help him. He tried to sit up, wincing sharply, and she rushed forward without thinking, steadying the bowl under his hand as he scooped a small bite, his fingers shaking. The barn smelled of old hay and rain-damp timber, and outside, the horizon dimmed to violet while a single star blinked alive. Eliza had lived alone since spring, since the fever took her mother and the sheriff sent her to work in exchange for food. But nobody checked on her after dark, and nobody cared where she wandered. So she had come back here because something about the Apache's silence felt safer than the boys' mocking laughter at the bunkhouse or the cook's sharp tongue. "I won't stay long," she murmured, sitting on a broken beam a few feet away. Her knees pulled close as he ate slowly, each movement strained but grateful. When he finished, he set the bowl down with deliberate slowness and touched his chest with 2 fingers, then nodded toward her, some gesture she didn't know but felt like a thank you. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, unsure if he understood. "They'd run you out, or worse." And his gaze drifted to the open barn door where dusk pooled like ink, as if he knew exactly what danger waited outside. A shiver crawled through her when a distant coyote yipped, and the warrior lifted his head weakly, listening, the tendons in his neck tightening. For a heartbeat, it felt like the whole world stilled, only her breath and his quiet rasp filling the barn, and in that stillness, Eliza understood something she could never say aloud. She was no safer in the settlement than he was on its outskirts, and somehow, tonight, it felt like they were both hiding from the same kind of loneliness. When he lowered his head again, exhaustion washing over him, she rose slowly, dusted her dress, and whispered, "I'll come back," before slipping into the deepening night, unaware that the choice she'd just made would change not only her life, but the prairie's quiet dawn as well. Eliza hardly slept, tossing on her thin cot as the moonlight stretched across the small room she shared with no one. The sheriff's distant orders drifting faintly from the street outside. She kept seeing the Apache's face, exhausted, guarded, yet strangely calm, and every time she closed her eyes, she imagined him alone in that collapsed barn with only the wind for company, bleeding into old hay while the settlement slept unaware. By the time dawn bruised the sky, she had already slipped out the back door, carrying a crust of bread and a damp cloth, her bare feet crunching softly over frostbitten grass. The closer she came to the barn, the more her heartbeat sped, because something felt different, wrong, even from a distance. The air was heavy, as if listening. A faint column of smoke rose from inside the broken roof, thin as a whisper. She froze, clutching the bread to her chest, but before fear could drag her back, a shadow shifted behind the doorway, and the wounded Apache stepped out, not standing tall, but upright enough to lean on a broken beam wrapped in the old tarp she'd left him. You're walking," she murmured, astonished. He wasn't healed, not even close. Sweat glistened at his temples, and his breaths were shallow. But he was awake, alert, and watching her with a sharpness that made her feel both exposed and strangely protected. He said something in a language she didn't know, low, rhythmic, strained, and pointed at the open field beyond the barn, then at her, as though warning her. I'm not afraid," she lied, stepping closer. He shook his head once, firm. She understood. She should be. Before she could reply, the faintest rumble rose on the wind, a deep cadence rolling beneath the quiet morning. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, pale gold, unmarred. Then her breath hitched. Not thunder, drums, very far away, but steady, purposeful, traveling across the prairie like a heartbeat she had never heard before. The Apache's gaze shifted toward the sound, something fierce flickering in his eyes. Hope, fear, longing, she couldn't tell. "Your people?" she whispered, and he didn't answer, but the set of his jaw was answer enough. Eliza stepped inside the barn instinctively, feeling the sudden need to hide despite not knowing why. He followed her with slow, limping steps, lowering himself back into the hay with a heavy breath, as though the short walk had drained every drop of strength he'd gained. She knelt beside him, pressing the damp cloth gently to his brow. And he didn't flinch this time. The drums grew louder, still distant but no longer ignorable, and for the first time, fear spread through her chest, not of him, but for him. If the sheriff heard those drums, or if the ranch hands spotted riders cresting the ridge, there would be trouble, bad trouble. She swallowed hard. "They won't hurt you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the riders or the settlers. He opened his eyes at her voice, studying her with a depth she couldn't decipher, then lifted one trembling hand and drew a line in the dirt. Two shapes, circles, connected by a curved line between them. She didn't understand, but he did. He tapped one circle, then the other, then the line. You, me, path. Connected, bound somehow, even if she didn't yet know why. Footsteps suddenly crunched outside the barn, heavy, unfamiliar. Eliza's pulse exploded with panic. She pressed a finger to her lips, urging the Apache to stay silent, though he was already reaching instinctively for a weapon he didn't have. Voices drifted closer, two ranch hands arguing about missing tools, and Eliza felt her chest tighten as she positioned herself in front of the wounded warrior, shielding him without thinking. The footsteps lingered near the door, then faded as the men walked on, never looking inside. Only when silence returned did she release the breath she'd been holding. The Apache's eyes softened, not with gratitude alone, but with something resembling recognition. She had protected him. And in doing so, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. When the drums faded into the far horizon, swallowed by distance, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Dawn was coming. And with it, consequences. Eliza returned before sunrise the next morning, clutching a bowl of thin porridge she'd stolen from the kitchen, her breath fogging in the cold as the first pale streaks of daylight touched the wheat stubble behind the barn. She expected to find the Apache asleep, still fighting fever, but instead, he was sitting upright, eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for something she could not see. She hesitated in the doorway, her fingers tightening around the bowl. "I brought you food," she whispered. He didn't reach for it. His gaze remained on the open plains, his body tense in a way that made her throat tighten. Only when she stepped closer did he finally look at her, and in the fragile morning glow, she saw something new in his face. Not fear, not pain, but certainty. Whatever he was waiting for, it was coming. She set the bowl beside him, kneeling in the hay, despite the cold floor biting through her dress. His hand brushed hers accidentally when he reached for the spoon, and the unexpected warmth of his skin shot a shiver through her. Not fear, just the strange awareness that had been forming ever since she first lifted him from the dirt. "What is it?" she asked softly. "What's out there?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he inhaled sharply and tilted his head, listening to something too faint for her to hear. Moments later, she heard it too, hooves, many of them, moving with deliberate rhythm across hard earth. Her heartbeat raced, not settlers, not ranch hands. They rode differently, closer, unified, like a single living force. The Apache warrior's shoulders eased, tension melting into relief. His people, they were coming for him. Before she could stand, the first rider appeared on the ridge, a tall figure on a paint horse, feathers woven through his hair, sunlight striking the war markings across his chest in deep red. Eliza's breath caught. One rider became 3, then 6, then dozens, cresting the hill in a sweeping formation that moved like wind made flesh. They were silent, except for the drum of hooves, their eyes sharp, unreadable, fixed on the barn that hid their wounded brother. Eliza stepped instinctively in front of the Apache, even though she knew she could do nothing to stop them if they wished harm. But the warrior behind her touched her wrist lightly, a gesture both calm and restraining. "Do not fear," she understood without a word. The riders slowed, encircling the barn in a wide, protective arc instead of a threatening one. A man dismounted, older, broader, with gray braided through his hair. His face held years of storms and wisdom, and when he looked at the wounded Apache, his expression broke into a rare, fierce tenderness. Father, leader, something important. He spoke in their language, his voice deep as stone, and the injured warrior responded weakly, gesturing toward Eliza. The chief turned to her, and for a heartbeat, she felt the weight of his gaze like an arrow, not meant to wound but to judge. She lowered her eyes but did not step back. After a long moment, the chief approached, stopping only a foot from her. He lifted a hand slowly, palm open, not to touch her, but to offer acknowledgement, respect, gratitude. She exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath since the first rider crested the ridge. Behind him, several warriors knelt beside the injured man, supporting him gently, speaking to him with voices that carried relief and affection. Yet he kept looking at her, as if needing to be certain she understood he hadn't forgotten what she'd done. One of the younger warriors brought forward a deer-hide bundle and set it at her feet. She blinked. I can't take anything," she whispered, stepping back. The chief spoke again, firmer this time, and though she didn't know the words, she felt their meaning settle heavily into her chest. "You cared for him. You saved him. This is owed." She crouched slowly, untying the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a small woven pouch of crushed herbs, a carved bone pendant shaped like a soaring bird, and a strip of dyed cloth embroidered with symbols she could not read, but felt, somehow, honored by. Gifts. For her. The first gifts anyone had given her since the sheriff's wife died months ago. She didn't realize she was crying until the chief lifted a feather from his horse's reins and placed it gently in her hand, closing her fingers around it, the gesture intimate, ceremonial. Behind her, the wounded Apache spoke softly to her for the first time with a voice not broken by pain. "Dawn brings thanks." Just then, a distant gunshot cracked across the prairie, jolting every warrior, freezing the chief mid-step and ripping the morning calm apart. Eliza's stomach dropped. Riders looked toward town, toward the sheriff's office, toward the place she came from. And in that instant, she understood. Whatever waited at sunrise wasn't just gratitude. A storm was coming, one that would pull her and the Apache she'd saved into its center. The gunshot echoed a second time, rolling over the plains like thunder trapped in a narrow sky, and every Apache warrior shifted instantly, hands finding bows, spears, and rifles with the fluid discipline of men who had survived too many betrayals to hesitate now. Eliza stood frozen between them and the barn door, her pulse hammering in her ears as her mind raced through every memory tied to that sharp, metallic sound, because she knew exactly who fired it and why. Her late father's deputy badge might have been buried with him, but the sheriff who replaced him had never forgotten that she was the child he failed to protect when her family died. He carried guilt like a shadow and fear like a gun that was always half drawn, and if he thought an Apache war party had come within a mile of his town, he would act before thinking, shoot before speaking, and make everything worse than it already was. The Apache chief gave a low command, and several riders peeled off toward the ridge to scout the source of the sound, their silhouettes cutting clean shapes against the pale morning sun. The wounded warrior, despite barely being able to sit up minutes ago, tried to push himself to his feet, gasping something urgent. But Eliza pressed her hands to his shoulders, forcing him back down with all the stubborn strength she had learned growing up on hard land. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered fiercely. "Not until I know it's safe." His breath trembled, frustration warring with pain, but he didn't fight her again. Instead, he reached out and touched the carved bone pendant they had given her, his fingers brushing the bird shape as if reminding her of something she hadn't yet understood. Outside, the chief stopped in the doorway and turned back to look at her. A long, searching look, the kind that carried questions without sound. Was she trustworthy? Was she frightened? Was she a settler girl alone, capable of standing between two worlds about to collide? She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. "If the sheriff comes here," she said, steadying her voice, "he'll see you all as a threat. He won't ask who hurt who. He'll assume you're the danger." The chief's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of offense he allowed. He answered in English this time, the words gravel deep but clear. "We came for our son, not for your war." She nodded. "I know, but he doesn't." A rumble of hooves grew louder, 3 Apache scouts returning at full speed. One spoke quickly, gesturing toward the main road leading from town, miming riders approaching, guns ready. The chief's expression sharpened. The sheriff was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. Panic flickered in her chest, but Eliza forced herself to breathe. She knew the sheriff, knew how he thought, how he reacted, how he tried and failed to fill the space her father left behind. And she also knew that if he rode into a group of Apaches gathered behind her barn, fear would ignite fear, instinct would ignite instinct, and someone would fire a shot that couldn't be taken back. "Let me talk to him," she said suddenly, stepping forward. The warriors murmured uneasily, but she pushed on. "He listens to me. I can stop him before he does something stupid." The chief studied her, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were weighing not just her words, but her spirit. "Why you?" she swallowed. "Because he still thinks he owes my father, and because he believes I'm all he has left to protect." That truth hung in the cold air between them. Finally, the chief nodded once. Then he stepped aside, clearing the path. Eliza stepped out into the rising dawn, the feather he had given her fluttering in her hand like a fragile promise she didn't yet understand. The wheat fields glowed pale gold under the early sun, peaceful in a way that made the approaching danger feel heavier, sharper, wrong. And then she saw them. A dozen riders cresting the ridge, sheriff in front, rifle across his saddle, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the barn as if preparing for the worst story he could imagine. Eliza didn't think. She didn't allow herself time to fear. She broke into a run, sprinting across the field toward him, arms raised, hair flying, voice cracking the morning stillness as she shouted, "Sheriff, stop! Don't shoot! Please don't shoot!" His horse skidded, the other riders pulling up behind him in a storm of dust. "Eliza!" he shouted, stunned. "Get away from there! They'll kill you!" "No!" she gasped, breathless as she stumbled to a halt in front of his horse. "They won't. They didn't. They're not here to fight." He frowned, torn between fear and authority. "Then why are they here?" Behind her, the Apache chief stepped out of the barn's shadow, tall, silent, unarmed. The sheriff's men tensed, hands twitching toward their guns. Eliza lifted both hands, palms outward, standing between them like a single fragile fence post dividing storm from storm. "They came," she said softly, "because I saved one of their own." And as the sheriff stared at her, confusion and disbelief swirling behind his eyes, a new sound rose behind her, one she hadn't known to expect, the low, mournful notes of an Apache mourning chant. Only, it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like honoring. It sounded like gratitude, and it was aimed at her. The sheriff stiffened at the sound rising from behind the barn, a deep, rhythmic chant carried by the morning wind, ancient and solemn, nothing like the war cries he'd been raised to fear. His grip tightened on his rifle anyway, instinct welded into his bones by years of frontier stories told around saloon tables. But Eliza stepped closer, placing her small hand on the reins near his boot, grounding him in a way no grown man ever had. "You don't need your gun," she whispered. "Not today." He looked down at her, really looked, and saw not the orphan girl he'd sworn to keep an eye on, but someone standing firm in a storm that terrified him. Her hair was wild from running, her cheeks flushed, her dress streaked with dust, yet her eyes held a steady, unshakable truth. She had seen something he hadn't, understood something he feared to know. Behind her, the Apache chief stepped forward fully into the light, hands empty, the morning sun catching the subtle paint across his cheekbones. And then more riders emerged. First 5, then 10, then nearly 20, each dismounting quietly, each lowering weapons, each bowing their heads toward the wounded warrior inside the barn. One of the sheriff's men muttered, "God help us," but not in fear, almost in reverence. The sheriff swallowed hard. "Eliza, What exactly did you do?" She shook her head. "Nothing. I just fed him, helped him breathe. I didn't want him to die alone." A soft rustle passed through the tribe as an elder approached, a tall man with gray woven through his braids. He carried a single long feather, white-tipped with ash black, and he moved as though every step mattered. When he reached the chief, they exchanged a quiet word. Then both turned to face Eliza. She froze, heart pounding. The elder touched his chest, then hers, then pointed to the barn. A simple gesture, heavy as prayer. "What's he saying?" the sheriff asked warily. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper. "He's saying they know, and they honor it." The sheriff blinked at her. "Honor? For feeding a wounded enemy?" She turned to him, expression soft, but resolute. "Maybe he wasn't their enemy. Maybe he was just another son." At that moment, the chanting deepened, and a pair of warriors stepped out, carrying the wounded man on a stretcher woven from freshly cut willow branches. His eyes were open, clearer now, fixed on Eliza with something that made her breath catch. Recognition, gratitude, and a quiet promise she didn't understand yet. Then something remarkable happened. The entire war party, every warrior, every elder, turned toward her and bowed their heads. The sheriff exhaled sharply, stunned, speechless. His men didn't dare move. "Eliza," he murmured, voice cracking, "do you know what this means?" She shook her head slowly. "It means," he whispered, chest tightening with something halfway between awe and fear, "that you've been accepted by a people who don't offer acceptance lightly. You've done something no one else in this territory has managed." But Eliza wasn't listening to him anymore. She was watching the wounded Apache as he lifted one trembling hand toward her, fingers curling slightly in silent farewell, or perhaps silent invitation. She stepped closer until she stood beside the stretcher. He searched her face, then spoke a single quiet word in his language. The elder translated, voice low and reverent. "He says, your hands brought him back. Our dawn belongs to you." The sheriff's breath left him in a rush. And just as the war party prepared to lift their wounded brother and return to their hidden path, the chief approached Eliza once more and pressed into her palm a small braid of horsehair tied with red thread. Symbol of respect, symbol of kinship, symbol of something she wasn't old enough to name, but old enough to feel. As the tribe rode away, disappearing into the golden fields, the sheriff finally found his voice. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I think the whole territory just changed, because of you." But she only watched the horizon, the braid warm in her hand, the dawn wind brushing her hair like a blessing she hadn't asked for but somehow earned, never imagining what the next sunrise would bring. By the time the war party vanished beyond the far ridge, the sheriff and his men could barely find words, but Eliza felt something else entirely, a strange, warm pressure in her chest that made the world feel bigger and smaller at the same time. Like she'd stepped through a door she never knew existed. She held the horsehair braid tightly, tracing the red thread with her thumb, not realizing how significant it was until she and the sheriff walked back toward town and saw the faces waiting for them. Townsfolk gathered near the main well, murmuring anxiously because someone had spotted riders on the horizon earlier, and word had already spread that Apaches were close. When they saw Eliza return unharmed at the sheriff's side, whispers snapped into stunned silence, and the sheriff raised a hand for calm. But the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. "Easy now," he called, though his voice wavered. There's no attack coming, and that alone was enough to break the crowd into worried mutters. No attack meant there had been a meeting, and a meeting usually meant demands or danger, so all eyes turned to Eliza. Mrs. Jetson, who ran the laundry and never liked anyone, pointed at the braid in the girl's hand and gasped, "She's marked! Lord above, she's marked by them!" And several people took a step back as if Eliza were suddenly something strange and untouchable. The sheriff rounded on the woman with a glare, saying, "She's not marked, she's respected." But the town had never been good at separating fear from superstition, and even the children stared as though she'd changed into something they didn't recognize. "What did you do?" asked Mr. Fletcher, voice quivering. And Eliza opened her mouth to answer, but the sheriff cut in first. "She saved a wounded Apache, kept him alive, kept peace where there could have been blood." Yet instead of admiration, the crowd only simmered with unease because none of them had seen an Apache bow his head in peace before. None of them had heard dawn chants meant for a settler child. Eliza stood still under their scrutiny, gripping the braid so tightly her knuckles whitened, and just when the silence grew sharp enough to hurt, old Reverend Marks stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane as he peered at the braid, then at her, his lined face unreadable. "Child," he murmured, "do you understand what you hold?" And Eliza swallowed, whispering, "Respect, I think," but he shook his head slowly, eyes narrowing with a mix of wonder and worry. "No, Eliza Turner, that is not just respect, that is recognition. Among the Apache, a braid tied in red is given to one who has acted with the heart of kin. You have been acknowledged as someone who sees beyond fear, and they will not forget that." And at his words, the crowd shifted again, some in awe, others in fear, because being recognized by a tribe meant connection, and connection meant unpredictable consequences. The sheriff stepped closer to Eliza protectively, his hand hovering near her shoulder, and said, "She deserves thanks, not suspicion." But Reverend Marks exhaled deeply, shaking his head once more, as if burdened by something heavier than simple gratitude. "Sheriff, the tribe will return," he said quietly. "Not in anger, but in obligation. When a child feeds a wounded warrior, she binds her fate to theirs. One day, at dawn or dusk, they will bring her a gift, something greater than that braid, and the town must be ready to accept what it means." And though nobody understood his words fully, a ripple of apprehension spread through the gathered faces. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from confusion, because she hadn't asked for any of this. She had only wanted the wounded man not to die alone. Yet now the entire settlement stood staring at her, as though the horizon behind her carried omens she could not see. The sheriff finally placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said, firm and low, "She's coming with me," and guided her away from the crowd as murmurs swelled again, the word Apache threading through the air like a thorn. But Eliza kept walking, her jaw tight, the braid warm in her hand, unaware that this single morning, this single act of compassion, had already set a promise in motion that no one, not even the chief, could unwind. That night, long after the last lantern in town had been blown out and the sheriff's house had settled into its usual quiet, Eliza lay awake beneath the quilt Rosa had stitched years ago, her fingers brushing the horsehair braid resting on the small table beside her, unable to shake the feeling that the world outside the window was holding its breath. And when the sheriff stepped in to check on her, pretending he was only passing through, even though she knew he wasn't. She offered him a tired smile, whispering, "They all looked at me like I'd done something wrong." But he shook his head hard, sitting on the edge of her bed with the heaviness of a man who'd seen fear destroy towns before, murmuring, "People fear things they don't understand, Eliza. That doesn't make them right." And though his words were steady, she could hear worry tucked beneath them, like a low note in a song. Outside, the wind stirred dry grass across the yard, and the sheriff's dog let out a single uneasy bark, as if sensing something moving in the distance, which made Eliza sit upright, heart thumping, asking softly, "They won't come tonight, right?" But before he could answer, before he could offer comfort or caution, a distant sound rolled toward them. A deep, rhythmic pulse, like drums carried through the canyon, too steady to be the wind, too deliberate to be anything but intention. And the sheriff froze, eyes flicking toward the dark window, whispering, "They're here." Not with fear, but with an understanding that something sacred, something irreversible was approaching. Eliza rose slowly, her breath catching as the drum beats grew clearer, joined by low-voiced chants that braided with the night air. And when she stepped to the window, she saw them, silhouettes appearing at the far edge of town where moonlight spilled along the dirt road. A line of Apache riders moving with quiet purpose, torches burning low in their hands so the flames glowed like small suns drifting through the darkness. The sheriff placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but made no move to stop her when she reached for the braid, instinctively knowing she needed it with her. And together they stepped outside into the cool night, just as the riders halted at the fence line. The one at the front dismounted with the slow, deliberate grace of a man accustomed to ceremony, and when he stepped into the lantern glow of the sheriff's porch, Eliza recognized him, the wounded warrior she had fed, now standing tall and strong, his shoulder fully healed, his face calm but carrying a weight she could feel even from several steps away. He approached without aggression, stopping several feet from her, and the sheriff shifted subtly, protective but respectful, while Eliza held the braid close to her chest as though it might steady her heart. Then the warrior spoke a single name, her name, Eliza, in an accent shaped by canyon winds and ancient songs, and hearing him say it, softly, reverently, made her breath tremble because it did not sound like a greeting, but like a recognition. He extended his hand slowly, palm upward, revealing not a weapon, but a small bundle wrapped in deer skin, marked with ochre lines that seemed to glow faintly under torchlight, and every Apache rider behind him lowered their gaze as he held it toward her. A gesture that made the sheriff tense, unsure whether to allow her to step forward, but Eliza sensed no danger, only something solemn that felt older than the town itself. She swallowed, took a hesitant step, then another, the night air tightening around her until she stood close enough to see that the warrior's eyes were not fierce, but grateful, and when she whispered, "Why have you come?" he answered in English, rough but clear, "A wound repaid is not enough. The chief has spoken your name." And the words seemed to crack the night open, for if the chief himself had spoken, it meant this was no simple thank you, no passing gesture, but a tribal acknowledgement that carried weight far beyond her understanding. The warrior lifted the bundle slightly, adding, "At dawn, you will understand." And though she wanted to ask more, the question dissolved on her tongue as he placed the bundle gently into her hands before stepping back toward his waiting horse. The riders turned without another word, their torches drifting into the darkness like fireflies swallowed by the horizon, leaving Eliza standing barefoot on the porch, clutching the deerskin bundle as though it were alive, her pulse loud in her ears, while the sheriff whispered beside her, "Whatever's inside, it's meant for you." And she knew, deep in the quiet place behind her ribs, that nothing about her life would remain ordinary come morning. Eliza barely slept, lying beneath the quilt with the deerskin bundle resting on her chest like a second heartbeat, and every time she closed her eyes, she heard echoes of the drum beats, the soft reverence with which the Apache warrior had spoken her name. And the sheriff sat beside the cold stove through most of the night, pretending to whittle but glancing at her every few minutes as if making sure she hadn't vanished into some fate he couldn't predict. When first light finally brushed across the windows, pale and thin as a shy visitor, Eliza sat up with a kind of trembling resolve, her fingers tightening around the bundle as though it might crumble if she hesitated. And the sheriff rose too, rubbing the back of his neck, asking quietly, "You sure you want to open it now?" But she nodded because the weight of the unknown had grown heavier than the fear. She untied the leather cord and unwrapped the deerskin slowly, layer by careful layer, until something soft and white spilled into her lap, an intricately woven dress, pale as morning light, decorated with hand-stitched lines of red and blue, and as she lifted it fully, she realized it was not a simple garment, but a ceremonial maiden's dress, the kind reserved for sacred rites, for unions blessed by the tribe's ancestors, and her breath fractured into a dozen pieces because she knew without needing the sheriff to say it, that such a dress was not gifted lightly. Beneath it lay a strip of cured hide, etched with Apache script, the symbols flowing like water. But the sheriff knelt beside her and whispered the rough translation he'd learned from years of peacekeeping. "A good deed is not forgotten. A life given is a bond. A name spoken by the chief is a path chosen." Eliza stared at the words until they blurred, whispering, "I didn't save him for anything in return. I didn't even know his name." And the sheriff answered gently, "That's exactly why it matters," just as a faint sound began outside, the rhythmic approach of hooves, slower and more deliberate than the night before, a procession rather than a warning. Eliza stood, clutching the dress to her chest, and stepped out onto the porch as the rising sun washed the prairie in soft gold, revealing a group of riders approaching from the east, their horses walking in ceremonial formation, and at their center rode the Apache chief himself. Tall and dignified, his hair tied with red cloth that fluttered in the morning breeze, he dismounted with a grace that made the world seem to hold still, and when he approached, the tribe parted behind him like a river making room for a stone older than time. Eliza's heart thudded unevenly as the chief stopped before her, his gaze steady, not harsh, not demanding, simply knowing, as though he had seen her long before she ever stepped onto this porch. He lifted one hand and touched his chest, speaking her name in a low, resonant voice that carried the weight of a ceremony she didn't fully understand, then gestured to the dress she held, saying in English thick with his native rhythm, "This is not a command. It is an honor. You fed a wounded son when others would have left him for the buzzards. You offered life without fear. The spirits see such things." The sheriff shifted beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow, protective by instinct. But Eliza stepped forward on her own, feeling something steady rise within her, like a truth waking up. "Why me?" she asked softly, and the chief answered, "Because the girl who saves a warrior becomes part of the story of his people, then added after a moment of silence. If you wear this dress at sundown, our tribe will welcome you, not as a stranger, as one who has been chosen. The words struck her like wind against bare skin, gentle but shaking her to the core, and she looked down at the dress, her fingers trembling over the stitches, imagining herself wearing it, standing in a circle of firelight, belonging somewhere she never expected. She wondered if this was destiny or accident, fate or consequence, or simply kindness repaid in a way that felt too large for her small life. But when she lifted her eyes again, the chief's gaze held no pressure, only quiet invitation, and something inside her softened, because it was the first time in years someone looked at her not with pity, not with suspicion, but with recognition. As the tribe waited in stillness, the morning sun warming her face, Eliza drew a slow breath and whispered, I don't know what I'm meant to be," and the chief replied, "Then let the day show you," before, turning and leading his people back toward the ridge, their horses stepping in perfect harmony, leaving the sheriff and Eliza standing in the doorway together, holding a ceremonial dress that felt too sacred to touch, and yet somehow, impossibly, meant for her. The sun climbed higher through the late morning haze, as Eliza paced the porch with the ceremonial dress folded carefully over her arms, every step a tug of war between fear and a strange, rising certainty she didn't know how to name. The sheriff watched her from the doorway, trying and failing to hide the worry in his eyes, because he had raised enough orphans and buried enough mistakes to know that choices made on days like this changed entire lives. Yet he also understood that this wasn't a decision he had the right to influence, so he simply said, "You don't owe anyone anything, Eliza," and she answered without looking up, "But maybe I owe myself something." And as the wind moved across the plains, she felt the truth of it settle in her bones. She had spent her entire life surviving other people's choices, her father's temper, her aunt's scorn, the town's whispering, and here, for the first time, stood a moment that belonged to her alone. She carried the dress inside, running her fingers over the stitching, noticing how each bead and thread seemed placed with intention, not decoration, and when she held the garment up to her frame, she felt a pull deep inside, not because it was beautiful, but because it was offered with respect, something she'd known so little of. The sheriff cleared his throat as she changed behind the curtain, and when she stepped out wearing the dress, soft white deerskin resting against her shoulders, red and blue lines tracing her silhouette, he froze as if seeing a truth he'd missed for years. "You look," he started, then stopped, rubbed a hand over his jaw, and finally managed, "like someone who's finally standing where life meant her to stand." Eliza swallowed hard, her throat tight, and whispered, "I'm scared," to which he replied softly, "Courage ain't the absence of fear, just choosing something worth walking toward." As noon approached, horses appeared again on the horizon, their shapes small at first, and then sharpening into color and motion. But this time, the riders weren't arriving with ceremonial stillness. They came carrying woven baskets, blankets, carved staffs, and bundles wrapped in bright cloth, gifts held with both hands as though carrying pieces of their own history. Children ran ahead, laughing, and older women walked arm in arm behind them, eyes warm, studying Eliza not like an outsider, but like a question they were ready to answer. The sheriff stepped back instinctively, giving her space, though his hand hovered near her back out of habit. but she didn't step behind him the way she once might have. Instead, she held her ground on the porch, shoulders trembling but lifted, the dress catching the breeze as if waking. The Apache chief approached first, his expression unreadable, but his gaze undeniably proud, and he lifted one palm in greeting before speaking with the steady tone of someone delivering a verdict long considered. "Girl who feeds the wounded," he said, using the honor title they had given her. "The tribe comes not to take, but to give." One by one, tribe members placed gifts at her feet. A basket filled with winter herbs for healing, a soft pelt for warmth, a carved bone pendant representing protection, a small beaded sash like the ones young women wore during rites of passage, and finally a folded cloth containing a headband adorned with white feathers, reserved only for those who had been marked by a warrior's gratitude. The chief nodded toward it and said, "A man does not offer his life for a stranger. He offered his for you. That makes you part of his story and ours." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably at those words, but he said nothing, because he could see it too, the thread pulling Eliza toward a life she had never imagined and wasn't sure she deserved. As the tribe arranged the gifts, a small group of women stepped forward and gently touched Eliza's arms, adjusting the dress with soft, humming approval, and one of them murmured, "You wear it like someone born to it," a phrase so simple and kind that tears blurred Eliza's sight. The chief then lifted the pendant from the cloth and held it toward her. When she didn't move at first, he stepped closer and in a voice lowered to something nearly fatherly said, "In our ways, gratitude becomes kinship. This is not a chain. This is an open door." She hesitated only a heartbeat before bowing her head, and he placed the pendant around her neck with reverence that made the world feel still. The sheriff let out a slow breath he hadn't known he was holding, and Eliza felt her chest expand with something that wasn't fear anymore, something closer to awakening. As the tribe stepped back, forming a circle around the porch, drum beats began softly, the rhythm matching the steady thrum of her pulse, and the chief raised his voice so all could hear. "At sundown, we gather again. If you walk toward the fire, you walk toward family. If you do not, the gifts remain blessings, not bindings." The tribe mounted their horses and turned back toward the ridge, their presence lingering in the dust and the silence they left behind, and Eliza stood frozen on the porch, the pendant warm against her skin, and the wind tugging at strands of her hair as the sheriff finally stepped up beside her and said quietly, "Well, looks like fate's knocking louder than usual today." Eliza didn't answer, not yet, because she knew sundown was coming, and with it a choice that would shape the rest of her life. The sun slid low across the horizon, turning the plains into a sweep of gold as Eliza stood in the doorway of the small cabin, her hands trembling at her sides, her breath thin, her heart pulling in two directions at once. Behind her, the sheriff waited in stillness, arms crossed, though his eyes were soft, saying nothing, because he knew this wasn't a moment shaped by advice, but by whatever truth had been quietly growing inside her since the day she found the wounded Apache boy half buried under brush and decided, without thinking, to save a life that wasn't hers to claim. She stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath her feet, the pendant resting at the base of her throat warm enough to feel alive, and as she walked down the steps, the wind lifted the fringe of her dress, scattering shadows that danced ahead of her like small heralds guiding her path. The sheriff followed at a respectful distance, his boots crunching lightly in the tall grass. But when they reached the ridge above the gathering, he stopped, knowing instinctively he should go no farther, and whispered, "If you choose this, it'll be because it's yours, not because of what they want or what I fear." But she only nodded, her eyes anchored on the fire already burning in a wide circle below where the Apache tribe waited in quiet anticipation. No drums yet, no chants, only the steady flame rising against the coming dusk. She inhaled slowly, feeling her entire life, every moment of abandonment, every cold night, every whisper that she didn't belong, collect behind her like a shadow she was finally ready to step away from. And then her feet began to move, gentle at first, and then surer as she descended the hill, the firelight growing brighter with each step. When she reached the edge of the circle, the tribe parted without a word, creating an opening meant only for her, and she walked into it with her chin lifted and her pulse roaring like a second heartbeat. The women who had touched her arms earlier smiled with a warmth that felt like welcome, and the young warriors she had helped look at her with the kind of gratitude that carried no expectation, only memory. The chief stepped forward, his silhouette tall against the fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of earth and sky together. "Girl who saved our son, you have come. Fire witnesses what words cannot. Tell us, do you walk here as stranger, or as one who chooses kin?" The question struck her deep, not as pressure, but as truth seeking its shape, and she opened her mouth, but no sound came out, her eyes filling, the flames reflected in the wetness gathering there. She thought of the sheriff's steady care, of the tribe's returning dawn gifts, of her own lifelong hunger for a place where she wasn't surviving, but living. And then, in a voice that trembled but did not break, she whispered, "I choose kin, if you choose me." A hush fell over the circle, and then the chief bowed his head, the gesture slow and deliberate, a sign of honor seldom given, and said, "Then let this night mark union not of marriage but of belonging, chosen, not demanded." The drums began softly, the beat matching the flame's rise, and women draped a woven shawl over her shoulders, not as claim, but as welcome. She closed her eyes as the warmth settled around her, the fire's crackle blending with murmured blessings, and for the first time in her life she felt something she had never dared hope for. Home, not given, not forced, but chosen on both sides. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the sheriff at the ridge, standing very still, and though he was far, she could see the pride in the way his shoulders eased, the way his hat tipped just enough to acknowledge that this chapter of her life belonged to her alone. The tribe circled closer, singing low, and as the fire brightened into the full dark, Eliza stepped into her new place among them. No longer an orphan of the plains, but a woman seen, honored, and finally, truly claimed by a home she had walked toward with her own steady, trembling feet.